I never thought I'd have to run from my own family. But here I was, a 78-year-old woman, packing a single suitcase at 2 a.m. on Christmas Eve, while my daughter and son-in-law slept down the hall, unaware I'd overheard every word of their plan. My arthritic fingers fumbled with the zipper of my small travel bag. I'd packed light, just essentials. 3 changes of clothes, medication, my reading glasses, a photo of my late husband Frank, and a small jewelry box containing the few precious items I couldn't dare to leave behind. Everything else would have to stay. Everything I'd collected over 7 decades of living, suddenly worthless compared to my freedom. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m. I had to hurry. Sarah and Kevin had invited me to spend Christmas with them, acting unusually kind after years of strained visits and grudging phone calls. Now I understood why. The conversation I'd overheard while they thought I was napping had made everything painfully clear. "Mom's getting worse, Kevin. She forgot to turn off the stove again last week," Sarah had said, her voice carrying through the heating vent to my room upstairs. "That's the third time, Sarah. We can't keep worrying she'll burn her house down." Kevin replied, "The place at Pinewood Gardens has an opening after the holidays. Dr. Mercer already signed the evaluation. We just need to get her there, but she won't go willingly. You know how stubborn she is. That's why we're doing it this way. Christmas dinner, a little extra wine to calm her nerves, then we tell her it's just for a short evaluation. By the time she realizes it's more permanent, she'll be settled in." "What about her house and her things?" "The power of attorney you got her to sign last year covers everything. We'll list the house in January. The market's hot in her neighborhood. Between that and her savings, there should be plenty to cover Pinwood for years." I'd sat frozen on my bed, the book I'd been reading forgotten in my lap. My own daughter was planning to commit me to a nursing home, not because I needed care, but because they wanted my assets. Yes, I'd forgotten the stove a couple of times. Who has? And maybe I'd been a bit forgetful lately, misplacing my glasses or calling the cat by my long-gone dog's name, but I still balanced my checkbook to the penny each month. Still drove myself to the grocery store and book club. Still tended my garden and cooked my meals. The evaluation they mentioned had been a sham. Dr. Mercer had barely asked me anything during my last checkup. Instead, he'd spent most of the time whispering with Sarah in the hallway while I sat on the examination table like a child. I tucked my cell phone charger into the side pocket of my suitcase and took one last look around the guest room. On the bedside table sat the Christmas gifts I'd so carefully chosen for them, a cashmere scarf for Sarah and golf club covers for Kevin. Such thoughtful presents for such thoughtless people. I left them there, a final rebuke they wouldn't understand until it was too late. The hardest part was leaving without saying goodbye to my granddaughter Amy. At 16, she was the only one who still seemed to genuinely enjoy my company, but she was staying with her father for the holiday, Sarah's ex-husband who'd been written out of this family's story years ago. Perhaps that was for the best. Amy couldn't be blamed for her mother's schemes, and I couldn't risk her unwittingly alerting Sarah to my plan. I slipped my coat on and picked up my suitcase, wincing at the slight creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. My heart pounded as I made my way down the stairs, carefully avoiding the third step that always groaned under pressure. Years of visiting had taught me the secret language of this house, which doors squeaked, which floorboards betrayed movement, knowledge that would now aid my escape. Outside, the December air bit at my cheeks as I closed the front door behind me. Snow was falling gently, covering the driveway in a thin white blanket that muffled my footsteps. I'd called a taxi earlier, asking them to wait at the end of the block with the lights off. The driver had sounded confused but agreed for an extra $20. As I reached the street corner, I saw the taxi's silhouette, engine running, exhaust creating ghostly plumes in the cold night air. Freedom was just steps away. I cast one last glance at Sarah's house, decorated with twinkling Christmas lights and a wreath on the door. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family home. How deceptive appearances could be. I slid into the back seat of the taxi, my hands trembling not from the cold, but from the magnitude of what I was doing. "South Station, please," I said to the driver, a young man with curious eyes that glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Traveling for Christmas, ma'am?" he asked as we pulled away from the curb. "No," I replied, watching my daughter's house disappear around the corner. "I'm traveling for me." Little did I know as we drove through the silent, snow-covered streets of Boston that this wasn't just an escape, it was the beginning of something entirely new. The train station was eerily quiet at that hour, populated only by a few drowsy travelers and the occasional security guard. I purchased a one-way ticket to New York, not my final destination, but a necessary stopover. From there, I'd buy another ticket west. I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and Boston before Sarah realized I was gone. The train lurched forward, and I watched the snow-covered city slide past the window. Somewhere out there was the house I'd lived in for 43 years, the garden where I'd planted tulips every fall, the kitchen where I'd taught Sarah to bake her father's favorite apple pie. All of it now behind me, like distant stars I could see but never return to. But as the lights of Boston faded into the darkness, I felt something unexpected growing within me. Not sadness, but a fierce, determined hope. Whatever lay ahead couldn't possibly be worse than what I was leaving behind. New York was a blur of noise and motion. I navigated Penn Station with my small suitcase, keeping my head down and moving purposefully. Sarah would be awake by now, discovering my absence. She'd be calling my cell phone, which I'd left behind on the nightstand. Its battery removed, I had purchased a prepaid phone at a convenience store near the station. Another step in erasing my trail. I approached the ticket counter, my decision already made. "One way to Seattle, please," I told the agent. "Seattle?" she repeated, looking up from her computer. "That's quite a journey. 3-day trip with transfers in Chicago and Portland." "I have time," I said, sliding my credit card across the counter. "And I've always wanted to see the Pacific Northwest." This wasn't entirely true. I'd never given much thought to Seattle before today, but I needed somewhere far away, somewhere Sarah wouldn't think to look, somewhere I could disappear and reinvent myself. Frank and I had vacationed in Florida and Arizona, and Sarah knew all our old haunts, but we'd never ventured to the Pacific Northwest. It was terra incognita, unknown territory where I could become unknown too. I had just enough time to buy a sandwich and a newspaper before boarding. The train was fuller now, families traveling for the holidays, students heading home from college. I found my small roomette and settled in for the long journey. As the train pulled out of the station, I allowed myself a deep breath. Phase 1 of my escape was complete. The rhythmic clacking of the train tracks became a meditation as we rolled through the winter landscape. I had 3 days to think, to plan, to decide what Eleanor Miller would become in this new chapter of her life. 3 days to mourn what I was leaving behind and steel myself for what lay ahead. I had resources, thankfully. My monthly Social Security checks and teacher's pension would continue to be deposited in my account. I had about $9,000 in a separate savings account that Sarah didn't know about, emergency money I'd squirreled away over the years. And I was wearing my most valuable jewelry, my engagement ring, and the pearl necklace Frank had given me on our 25th anniversary. Not a fortune, but enough to start over. Night fell, and I tried to sleep in the narrow bed of my roomette, lulled by the movement of the train. But my mind kept returning to Amy, my sweet, artistic granddaughter, who sent me handmade cards and called me just to chat about books we both loved. Would she think I'd abandoned her? Would Sarah poison her against me? The thought brought tears to my eyes, but I brushed them away. Somehow, someday, I would find a way to let Amy know the truth. The next morning, I awoke to a changed world outside my window. We were passing through rural Pennsylvania, snow-covered fields stretching to the horizon, interrupted occasionally by small towns and frozen rivers. I made my way to the dining car and ordered breakfast, savoring the simple pleasure of making my own choice about what to eat and when. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see a woman about my age, with silver hair cut in a stylish bob. She gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Please," I said, gesturing to the chair. "I'm Vivian," she said, extending her hand. Heading to Chicago to see my son and his family. Eleanor? I replied, shaking her hand. Just traveling. Vivian raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, she launched into stories about her grandchildren and her book club back in Philadelphia. I found myself relaxing, even laughing at her description of her youngest grandson's school play disaster. It felt good to talk to someone who wanted nothing from me except conversation. What about you? She eventually asked. You said you're just traveling, but there's a story there, I can tell. I hesitated, fork poised over my scrambled eggs. How much could I safely share with this stranger? But something in Vivian's kind eyes made me want to unburden myself. I'm starting over, I said carefully. My daughter and her husband had plans for me that didn't align with my own. Vivian nodded slowly. Ah, the we know what's best for mother syndrome. I'm familiar with it. You too. My daughter-in-law had my bedroom measured for a nursery before I'd even agreed to move in with them, Vivian said with a wry smile. I sold my house and bought a condo in the same week. Sometimes you have to remind them that you're still the one in charge of your life. We talked through breakfast and beyond, sharing stories of children who saw us as problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. It was cathartic to speak these thoughts aloud, to have them validated by someone who understood. By the time Vivian left for her own compartment, we had exchanged email addresses. I'd created a new one at the station, under a variation of my middle name, and I felt lighter than I had in months. As the train continued westward, I pulled out my notebook and began to plan. I would need an apartment in Seattle, preferably something within my budget, but in a safe neighborhood. I'd need to set up a new bank account, perhaps under my maiden name to make it harder for Sarah to track me down. I'd need to find a community, places to go, things to do so I wouldn't just be trading one isolation for another. The train crossed into Ohio as evening fell again. I stared out the window at the lights of small towns appearing and disappearing in the darkness. Was I being reckless? Perhaps. Was I being unfair to Sarah, who might genuinely believe she was acting in my best interest? Maybe. But as the miles stretched between us, I became more certain that I was making the right choice. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from those who cannot see your worth. As I prepared for my second night on the train, my new prepaid phone buzzed with a text message. It was Vivian. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. You're braver than you know. Sleep well, friend. I smiled and tucked the phone away. One unexpected gift of this journey, a new friend who saw me clearly in just a few hours of conversation. Perhaps Seattle would hold more such surprises. What I didn't know then was that Sarah had already filed a missing persons report, that my face would soon be on social media posts and local news segments, that my carefully planned escape was about to become much more complicated than I had ever imagined. As the train rocked me to sleep, hundreds of miles from home, the first threads of a dragnet were being cast, a web I would need all my wit and determination to evade. Chicago brought a 6-hour layover, and the first real test of my resolve. As I waited in the Grand Hall of Union Station, I caught a glimpse of myself on a television screen mounted high on the wall. The sound was muted, but I could read the scrolling text beneath my driver's license photo, missing elderly woman from Boston. I quickly turned away, heart pounding, and moved to a quieter corner of the station. They were looking for me already. I shouldn't have been surprised. Sarah was nothing if not efficient, but seeing my face on the news made this all so much more real. I wasn't just a 78-year-old woman taking an impulsive trip. In their eyes, I was now a vulnerable elder who had wandered away, possibly confused and in danger. I pulled my scarf higher around my face and kept my head down as I made my way to a small cafe away from the main concourse. I needed to think. The original plan had been to continue on the train to Seattle, but now I wondered if that was too predictable. I sipped my coffee and considered my options. I could change my ticket, perhaps head south instead of west. Or I could stick with the original plan, but find a way to be less conspicuous. As I contemplated, a young woman sat down at the table next to mine. her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. A blog about urban gardening was on her screen. "Excuse me," I said before I could stop myself. "Are you a gardener?" She looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. "Yeah, I run a community garden in Portland, just heading back after visiting family for Christmas." "Portland, Oregon?" I asked. "That's right. You know it?" "It's amazing," she said, her face lighting up. "The growing season is incredible. Things that struggle elsewhere just thrive there." We chatted for a few minutes about gardening, a passion of mine since Frank and I had bought our first house. Something about this young woman, Lily was her name, made me trust her instantly. "I'm actually heading west myself," I said, "thinking of relocating." Lily looked at me with interest. "Really? She caught herself. "At my age?" I finished for her with a smile. "Yes, even old dogs can learn new tricks." She laughed. "Where are you thinking of going?" I had thought Seattle, but I'm open to suggestions. "Portland's amazing," she said immediately. "More affordable than Seattle, very walkable, great public transportation, and the gardening community is super welcoming." By the time my train was called, I had a new destination in mind, and Lily's contact information written in my notebook. "Let me know if you end up in Portland," she'd said. "I can introduce you to some gardening groups. They're always looking for people with experience." As the train pulled out of Chicago, heading west across the vast plains, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Portland, not Seattle, a slight but significant course correction, and a potential friend waiting at the end of the journey. I dozed off as we crossed into Iowa, the farmland stretching endlessly under the winter sun. In my dreams, I was digging in rich, dark soil, planting something new, something that would grow tall and strong in a place where no one knew my name or thought they knew what was best for me. When I awoke, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snowy landscape. My phone showed no service. We were truly in the middle of nowhere now. I made my way to the dining car for dinner, more relaxed than I'd been since leaving Boston. The further west we traveled, the safer I felt. After dinner, I returned to my roommate and checked my phone again. One bar of service now. On impulse, I opened the browser and searched for Portland, Oregon apartments for seniors. Dozens of options appeared, from luxury retirement communities to modest apartments in mixed-age buildings. I spent the evening researching neighborhoods, prices, and amenities, making notes and sketching out a budget. My teacher's pension and Social Security would cover a modest one-bedroom apartment, and basic expenses. The $9,000 in savings would help with deposits and furnishing the place. It would be tight, but doable. I'd lived through tighter times before. The next morning brought Montana, vast, rugged, and breathtaking. I spent hours just staring out the window at the mountains rising in the distance, thinking about the immensity of the country and how small my problems seemed in comparison. By afternoon, we were climbing through mountain passes, the train winding through tunnels and along precipitous drops that made my stomach lurch. When we finally pulled into Portland 2 days later, I felt as though I'd been traveling for months rather than days. My body ached from the confined space, and I was desperate for a hot shower and a proper bed. I had done it. I had crossed a continent to escape a fate others had chosen for me. Now it was time to choose my. The first order of business was finding a place to stay while I looked for an apartment. I took a taxi to a modest hotel downtown, paying cash for 3 nights. In my room, I finally allowed myself to fully relax, soaking in a hot bath and ordering room service, small luxuries that felt enormous after the cramped quarters of the train. That evening, I used the hotel's business center to check rental listings and send an email to Lily, letting her know I'd arrived. Then I opened my suitcase and carefully laid out my few belongings. Not much to show for 78 years of living, but also not much to weigh me down as I started anew. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I wondered what Sarah was doing right now. Had she given up looking for me? Was she worried or just angry? For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard, the cold calculation in their voices as they planned to strip me of my autonomy and assets. No, I wouldn't feel guilty for saving myself. Some bridges need to be burned so you can't be tempted to cross back over them. The following morning, I woke early, eager to explore my new city. The December air was chilly, but not nearly as biting as Boston's winter. A light mist hung over everything, softening edges and lending an ethereal quality to the streets. I walked for hours, getting a feel for downtown, noting the abundance of coffee shops, bookstores, and parks. People nodded and smiled as they passed, not the hurried, averted gazes I was used to back east. By afternoon, I had appointments to see 3 apartments the next day. One was in a seniors-only building, but the other 2 were in mixed-age complexes. I preferred the idea of not being segregated by age. One of the things I dreaded about Pinewood Gardens was being surrounded only by other elderly people, as if we needed to be quarantined from the young. Back at the hotel, I found an email from Lily inviting me to meet her at the community garden on Saturday. No pressure, she wrote, but if you'd like to see what we're doing and meet some fellow plant enthusiasts, we'll be there from 10 to 2. I replied immediately, accepting the invitation. Then I noticed another email. This one from Vivian. The subject line made my heart skip. You're on the news. She had attached links to several news stories. I clicked on the first one with trembling fingers. There I was, my driver's license photo next to a headline. Concern grows for missing Boston woman. The article quoted Sarah expressing worry about my cognitive decline and confusion, and urging anyone with information to contact the Boston police. The comments section was even worse. People speculating that I had wandered off in a state of dementia, or been taken advantage of by scammers, or even met with foul play. My disappearance had become entertainment, a mystery for strangers to solve from behind their keyboards. Vivian's message was simple. Thought you should know. Stay safe. They can't force you back if you're competent, and chose to leave. But be careful. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. This complicated things. If I tried to rent an apartment using my real name, would the landlord recognize me from the news? Would they call the police? I needed to be more careful now, more strategic. I ordered dinner to my room that night, not wanting to risk being seen in the hotel restaurant. As I picked at my salmon and rice, I considered my options. I could contact Sarah directly, let her know I was safe, but not coming back. But that would mean revealing my location, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. I could try to rent an apartment under a slightly different name, Eleanor Mills instead of Miller perhaps, but that might raise flags with background checks. The solution came to me as I was falling asleep. I needed an ally here in Portland, someone local who could help me navigate these complications. And I might have just found one in Lily. It was a risk trusting a stranger with my story, but sometimes the only way forward is to take a leap of faith. What I didn't realize then was that Sarah had already expanded her search. She'd checked my credit card statements and discovered the Amtrak purchase. By morning, police in multiple cities along the route would be reviewing security footage. The net was tightening, and I was about to face a choice that would determine whether my bid for freedom would succeed or fail spectacularly. But for now, I slept the sleep of the exhausted, dreaming of gardens and fresh starts in the gentle mist of my new home. The first apartment I viewed was a disaster, dark, musty, and up 3 flights of stairs that left me winded. The second was clean, but sterile, in a building that felt more like a hospital than a home. But the third, a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, spoke to me immediately. Hardwood floors, tall windows that let in what little winter light there was, a tiny balcony overlooking a courtyard with dormant flower beds. I could already imagine them in bloom come spring. I recently left an abusive situation, I said, the half-truth coming to me suddenly. I'm concerned about using my full legal name on paperwork that might be accessible. Mrs. Chen's expressions softened slightly. Family troubles? I nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate. She studied me for a long moment. I'll need some form of ID and proof of income, but I can be discreet about how the lease is filed. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. I can provide bank statements showing my pension deposits, and I can pay 3 months' rent in advance. We worked out the details, and by that afternoon, I had a key to my new home. The apartment was unfurnished except for a refrigerator and stove, but Mrs. Chen mentioned a thrift store nearby that delivered. Nothing fancy, but it'll get you started, she said as she left me alone in the empty space. The next few days were a blur of practical matters. I bought a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a comfortable armchair, and basic kitchen supplies. I opened a new bank account under my married name, but with my middle initial instead of my first name, Frances A. Miller, rather than Eleanor F. Miller. Small changes that might buy me time if anyone came looking. Saturday arrived misty, but mild. I took a bus to the address Lily had given me for the community garden. It was in a neighborhood called St. John's, about 20 minutes from my new apartment. The garden itself was larger than I expected, nearly an acre of raised beds, some covered with protective tarps for winter, others showing the hardy greens that could withstand the mild Portland winters. Lily spotted me as soon as I entered through the gate and hurried over, wiping her hands on her jeans. Eleanor, you made it. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling genuinely for what felt like the first time in ages. I wouldn't miss it. This is quite an operation you have here. Let me give you the tour, she said, looping her arm through mine in a casual gesture of friendship that touched me deeply. By lunchtime, I was pulling weeds alongside Lily, sharing tips about composting that I'd learned over decades of maintaining my own garden. It felt good to be useful, to have knowledge that others valued. When someone brought out a thermos of hot soup and passed cups around, I accepted gratefully, sipping the spicy vegetable broth as we all huddled under a small pavilion to escape a passing shower. So, Lily said as the others drifted back to their tasks, you really did it. You moved across the country. I nodded. It was time for a change. She seemed to sense there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, she said, there's a plot opening up next month, if you're interested. It's not huge, but it's enough space to grow quite a bit. I'd love that, I said immediately. Though I'm still getting settled. I just found an apartment a few days ago. Where are you staying? I described the converted Victorian and its location. Lily nodded approvingly. That's a great neighborhood. Easy bus access. Walkable to shops and restaurants. You chose well. More luck than planning, I admitted, but I'm happy with it. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself telling Lily more about my situation. Not everything, but enough that she understood I was starting over after a family conflict. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never doubting my version of events. Family can be complicated, she said finally. My own parents struggled when I decided not to follow the career path they'd planned for me. It took years for us to find a new equilibrium. I'm not sure my daughter and I will ever find that, I said, surprised by the sudden ache in my chest. Despite everything, I missed Sarah, or rather, I missed the relationship I wished we had. Give it time, Lily advised. You're both adjusting to a new reality. As I prepared to leave, Lily introduced me to Marcus, the garden coordinator, a gentle giant of a man with dreadlocks streaked with gray. Eleanor's interested in the plot that's opening up, she told him. We'd be glad to have you, he said warmly. Experience is always welcome here. We've got several gardeners who are, shall we say, enthusiastic but clueless. He winked at Lily, who rolled her eyes good-naturedly. I'll come by next week to fill out whatever paperwork you need, I promised. As I waited for the bus back to my apartment, I felt a newfound optimism. I had a place to live, the beginnings of a social circle, and a purpose. Not bad for less than a week in a new city, but my contentment was short-lived. When I returned to my apartment and checked my email at the public library down the street, I found a message from Vivian that sent a chill down my spine. Eleanor, they're saying on the news that the police have tracked your journey to Portland. Your daughter gave an interview saying she's flying out there to find you. Be careful. Attached was a link to a video. Sarah's face filled the screen, her expression a perfect mask of concern. "My mother is experiencing cognitive decline," she said to the reporter. "She became confused and left my home in the middle of the night during her Christmas visit. We're very worried about her safety, especially since she's in an unfamiliar city. I'm flying to Portland tomorrow to bring her home where she can get the care she needs." The report went on to mention that police in both Boston and Portland were cooperating in the search for a vulnerable elder who may be disoriented and in need of assistance. I closed the video, my hands trembling. Sarah was coming here, and she was bringing her narrative with her, the story of a confused old woman who needed to be rescued and controlled, a story that many would find more believable than the truth. I had to make a decision quickly. I could run again, leave Portland before Sarah arrived. But where would I go? How long could I keep running? Or I could stay and fight, assert my competence and my right to make my own choices. But that would mean confronting Sarah directly, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. As I walked back to my apartment, the mist thickened into a proper rain, soaking through my coat. I barely noticed. My mind was racing through options, strategies, possibilities. By the time I reached my building, I was drenched but resolved. I wouldn't run again. This was my home now, my choice. I would stand my ground. But first, I needed allies. And a plan. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, already composing emails in my head to Lily, to Mrs. Chen, to anyone who might help me maintain the freedom I'd fought so hard to claim. What I didn't know then was that Sarah wasn't coming alone. Kevin was with her, along with a doctor from Pinwood Gardens, and paperwork that could strip me of my autonomy in an instant if a judge found me incompetent. The battle for my independence was about to become much more complicated and much more public than I ever could have imagined. As I dried my hair and changed into warm clothes, Sarah's plane was already in the air, carrying her west toward a confrontation neither of us was truly prepared for. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, a rarity in Portland's winter, I was learning. The sunlight streaming through my windows felt like a good omen, but I knew better than to rely on omens. I needed concrete actions, a solid plan to counter Sarah's narrative. My first call was to Lily. I explained the situation as concisely as I could, that my daughter was coming to Portland with the intention of forcing me into a care facility against my will, using claims of cognitive decline as justification. "That's horrible," Lily said, her voice tight with indignation. "What can I do to help?" "I need witnesses," I said. "People who can testify to my competence if it comes to that. I've only been here a week, but you've seen me function. You know I'm not confused or disoriented." "Of course," she said immediately. "I'll help however I can, and I bet Marcus and some of the others from the garden would too." My next call was to Mrs. Chen. I'd been vaguer with her about my situation, but now I needed to be more forthcoming. To my relief, she was both understanding and practical. "I had a feeling it was something like this," she said. "My own mother went through similar with my brother. He thought he should control her money after my father died." She paused. "What do you need from me?" "If people come looking for me, my daughter or the police, I'd appreciate if you'd confirm that I'm a tenant who's paid her rent and caused no problems, that I seem perfectly capable of independent living." "Consider it done," she said firmly. "And Eleanor? There's a lawyer in the neighborhood who specializes in elder law. Myra Goldstein. She might be worth consulting." I thanked her and made a note of the name. A lawyer wasn't in my budget, but knowing one I could call in an emergency was reassuring. My third call was to the Portland Police non-emergency line. This was perhaps the riskiest move, but I needed to get ahead of Sarah's narrative. The officer who answered was professional but initially confused by my call. "Let me understand," he said. "You're reporting that you're not missing?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "My name is Eleanor Miller. My daughter Sarah Winters has filed a missing persons report in Boston, claiming I'm experiencing cognitive decline and wandered away confused. In reality, I left voluntarily because she and her husband were planning to commit me to a nursing home against my will and take control of my assets. I'm currently living in Portland by choice, am completely competent, and do not wish to be found or returned to Boston. There was a pause. Then, ma'am, would you be willing to come to the station to make a statement in person? That would help us document your situation accurately. I agreed to come that afternoon. After hanging up, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. Going to the police station would make my presence in Portland official in a way that could complicate Sarah's efforts to paint me as confused or incompetent. It was a calculated risk, but one I felt I needed take. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing my most put-together outfit, a navy blue pantsuit I'd worn to my retirement party years ago. I styled my hair neatly and applied a touch of lipstick. Appearance shouldn't matter in determining someone's competence, but I knew it did. I needed to look as far from the stereotype of a confused elderly woman as possible. Before leaving, I gathered important documents, my identification, bank statements, showing regular deposits from my pension and Social Security, the lease agreement with Mrs. Chen, and a handwritten timeline of events leading to my departure from Boston. I tucked everything into a leather portfolio Frank had given me for my 60th birthday. The familiar texture of it under my fingers gave me strength. The police station was busy but efficient. After explaining my situation to the desk sergeant, I was directed to a small interview room where Officer Rivera, a woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, took my statement. "I want to be clear, Mrs. Miller," she said after I'd explained everything. "You're an adult with the right to live wherever you choose. If you're competent to make your own decisions, no one can force you to return to Boston or enter a care facility against your will." "And how is my competence determined?" I asked, the question that had been weighing on me. "That would require a legal process, a competency hearing. Your daughter would need to provide evidence of impairment, and you'd have the right to contest it with your own evidence and witnesses." She made a copy of all my documents and entered my information into their system. "This will be on record now. If anyone reports you as a missing person locally, it will flag your statement. But Mrs. Miller, I should warn you, if your daughter has obtained any kind of guardianship order in Massachusetts, that could complicate things." My stomach tightened. Is that possible without my knowledge? In emergency situations, temporary guardianship can sometimes be granted ex parte, meaning without you present. But it would still need to be validated in Oregon, and you'd have the opportunity to contest it. By the time I left the station, I felt both more secure and more vulnerable. I had established myself officially as a competent adult who had relocated voluntarily, but I also understood better the legal mechanisms Sarah might use to challenge my independence. My next stop was a small cafe with Wi-Fi where I could check my email. There was a new message from Vivian. Sarah and Kevin's flight had landed in Portland. They were staying at the Hilton downtown and had scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning to appeal for help finding me. A press conference. Sarah was turning my private decision into a public spectacle. I felt a surge of anger, followed quickly by determination. Two could play at that game. I sent emails to Lily and Marcus, explaining the situation and asking if they'd be willing to appear with me at a press conference of my own, to counter Sarah's narrative before it took hold. Both responded quickly with enthusiastic agreement. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my ex-son-in-law, Robert. Sarah and Robert had divorced when Amy was 10, and Sarah had done her best to exclude him from family matters ever since. But Robert and I had always gotten along, and he had no reason to support Sarah's version of events. "Eleanor?" His voice was surprised but warm when he answered. "This is unexpected. Are you okay? Amy's been worried sick." "I'm fine, Robert. Better than fine, actually. But I need your help, and I need to speak with Amy." I explained the situation as succinctly as I could. Robert listened without interrupting, then let out a low whistle. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," he said. "Sarah's always had control issues, and since she married Kevin, well, let's just say I've had concerns about his influence." "Is Amy there? Can I speak with her?" "She's at a friend's house, but I'll call her right now." "She'll be overjoyed to hear from you. She's been frantic." "Eleanor, Sarah told her you were having memory issues and wandered off. The thought of Amy worried about me caused a pang of guilt. Tell her I'm perfectly fine and I'll explain everything. But Robert, there's something else I need to ask you. Anything. Would you be willing to make a statement contradicting Sarah's claims about my mental state? You've known me for almost 20 years. You know I'm not confused or incompetent. Absolutely, he said without hesitation. In fact, I can do better than that. I'm an attorney, Eleanor. I specialize in family law. I can help you fight this legally if it comes to that. Relief washed over me. I was hoping you'd say that. Sarah's holding a press conference tomorrow morning. I'm planning to hold one of my own in response. Bold move, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I can be on a plane to Portland tonight. Amy, too, if she wants to come. She's on winter break from school. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, I had assembled a small but formidable team. Lily and Marcus from the garden, Mrs. Chen, Robert, who had confirmed he was bringing Amy, and Officer Rivera, who had agreed to make a brief statement confirming that I had voluntarily presented myself to the police as competent and self-sufficient. I also had a venue, the community garden. Marcus had suggested it as a place that represented my new life and connections in Portland. We would hold our press conference an hour after Sarah's, giving the media time to travel from the Hilton to the garden. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a curious calm. After decades of avoiding confrontation, of trying to keep peace in the family at the cost of my own autonomy, I was finally standing up for myself. The Eleanor who had meekly accepted Sarah's increasing control would have been horrified, but this new Eleanor, Portland Eleanor as I was beginning to think of myself, felt only a steely resolve. Just before turning out the light, my phone rang. It was Amy. Grandma? Her voice was small and uncertain. Hello, sweetheart, I said, my own voice, suddenly thick with emotion. Are you okay? Mom said you were sick and confused and wandered away. I'm not sick or confused, Amy. I left because your mother and Kevin were planning to put me in a nursing home without my consent. I overheard them talking about it on Christmas Eve. There was a long pause. I believe you, she said finally. Mom's been weird about you for months. Always talking about how worried she was about you living alone, even though you were fine when I visited last summer. We talked for nearly an hour about my new apartment, the community garden, the friends I was making, about her school and her plans for college next year, about how much I missed her but how necessary it had been for me to leave. Dad and I are coming tomorrow, she said. He's booking flights right now. I'll be so happy to see you, I told her. But Amy, this might get complicated. Your mother isn't going to be happy about you taking my side. I'm not taking sides, she said with a wisdom beyond her years. I'm just standing up for the truth. And the truth is you're not confused or incompetent, and you have the right to live wherever you want. After we hung up, I lay in the darkness of my new bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of my building. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, perhaps even legal battles. But tonight I felt a deep sense of peace. I had allies. I had a plan, and most importantly, I had rediscovered my own voice, a voice that would not be silenced again. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something that made me smile into the darkness. In trying to control me, to diminish me, Sarah had inadvertently set me free. In her efforts to confine me to a nursing home, she had instead pushed me into a wider world filled with new possibilities. It wasn't the ending she had planned, but it was the beginning I needed. What would happen at tomorrow's dueling press conferences was still uncertain. Sarah had resources, influence, and a compelling narrative of a concerned daughter worried about her elderly mother. But I had something more powerful, the truth and the newfound courage to speak it loudly and clearly. As the rain began to tap gently against my window, I made a promise to myself, no matter what came next, I would never again surrender my voice or my choices to someone else's control. The battle for my independence was just beginning, but in the most important ways, I had already won. I had chosen freedom over safety, authenticity over comfort, and my own path over the one others had mapped out for me. And in that choice, I had found not just a new home, but a new self, stronger, braver, and more alive than I had been in years. I woke before dawn, my mind already racing with preparations for the day ahead. Outside, the rain had stopped, but a heavy fog wrapped around the buildings, turning the streetlights into soft, glowing orbs. I made coffee and stood by my window, watching the city slowly emerge from the mist. My phone buzzed with a text from Lily. Channel 8 confirmed they'll cover both press conferences. You ready for this? I texted back a simple, yes. Though my stomach was tight with nerves, I had never sought the spotlight, never imagined I'd be holding a press conference to defend my competence, but here I was. Robert called at 7 a.m. to let me know they'd landed. Amy couldn't wait until tonight, he explained. We caught the red eye. We're heading to the hotel now to shower and change. Then we'll meet you at the garden at 10:30. Sarah's press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. Mine for 10 a.m. The timing was deliberate. I wanted to counter her narrative quickly, before it had time to take root in public consciousness. I dressed carefully in a deep green blouse that brought out the color of my eyes, black slacks and sensible but stylish low heels. I applied makeup with a steady hand, not too much, just enough to look polished. My silver hair was neatly styled in the short, practical cut I'd worn for years. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman who was unmistakably in her 70s, but also unmistakably in command of herself. Good. Lily picked me up at 8:30. You look ready for battle, she said approvingly as I slid into her car. I feel like I'm heading to one, I admitted. Well, you've got an army behind you, she said, squeezing my hand briefly before starting the car. We decided to watch Sarah's press conference on Lily's phone from a cafe near the garden. As 9 a.m. approached, we huddled over the small screen, where a local news station was setting up a live feed from the Hilton's conference room. Sarah appeared at precisely 9, flanked by Kevin and a distinguished-looking older man she introduced as Dr. Mercer. My daughter looked exhausted but determined in a navy suit that eerily mirrored the one I'd worn to the police station. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady. I'm here today to ask for the public's help in finding my mother, Eleanor Miller, who left our home in Boston on Christmas Eve in a state of confusion. My mother has been experiencing cognitive decline for some time, and we're deeply concerned for her safety and well-being. She continued with a narrative that was technically accurate but fundamentally dishonest. Yes, I had left in the middle of the night without telling them, but not because I was confused. Yes, I had traveled across the country alone, but not because I was disoriented or irrational. Dr. Mercer spoke next, his voice carrying the authoritative weight of his profession. Mrs. Miller has shown signs consistent with early-stage dementia, including memory lapses, confusion, and impaired judgment. Her decision to leave her home and travel across the country alone is itself evidence of the poor decision-making that can accompany cognitive decline. I felt a surge of indignation. Dr. Mercer had spent all of 15 minutes with me during my last checkup. How dare he make such pronouncements based on such limited interaction? Kevin stepped forward next, his face arranged in an expression of concerned solicitude that made my skin crawl. We've been in contact with police in Portland, where we believe Eleanor may have traveled. We're offering a reward for information leading to her safe return. Please, if you've seen her or have any information, contact the authorities immediately. The screen showed my driver's license photo, an unflattering image from 5 years ago that made me look far older and more frail than I was. Then it cut to a reporter asking questions. Mrs. Winters, why do you believe your mother came to Portland specifically? Sarah hesitated, just for a moment. We're not entirely sure. She mentioned Portland once or twice in the past. I believe she and my father visited here decades ago. In her confused state, she may have fixated on that memory. Another lie. Frank and I had never visited Portland. Sarah was inventing connections to make her story more plausible. And what will happen when you find your mother? We'll bring her home to Boston, where she can receive the care and support she needs, Sarah said smoothly. We've arranged for her to stay at Pinewood Gardens, a wonderful facility that specializes in memory care. The press conference continued for another 10 minutes, with Sarah painting a picture of a loving daughter desperately worried about her confused, vulnerable mother. It was a compelling narrative, one that would resonate with anyone who had watched a parent age. By the time it ended, I was shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. "She's good," Lily said grimly, putting her phone away. "Very convincing. She's had plenty of practice manipulating people," I replied more bitterly than I'd intended. "Let's get to the garden. It's our turn now." The community garden was transformed when we arrived. Marcus had set up a small podium near the center, with the raised beds creating a natural amphitheater. Several news vans were already parked outside, and reporters were setting up cameras and microphones. Lily led me to a small shed where I could collect myself before the press conference. I was reviewing my prepared statement when there was a knock on the door. "Grandma?" I looked up to see Amy standing in the doorway, her eyes bright with tears. Behind her was Robert, looking exactly as I remembered him. Tall, slightly rumpled, with kind eyes and a determined set to his jaw. "Amy!" I opened my arms, and she rushed into them, hugging me tightly. "Oh, sweetheart, I've missed you so much." "I missed you too," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I was so worried when Mom said you disappeared." "I'm sorry I scared you," I said, holding her at arm's length to look at her properly. She'd grown taller in the months since I'd seen her last, her face losing some of its childhood roundness. "But I had to leave. I hope you understand." "I do," she said firmly. "Mom's been acting weird about you for months, always talking about how you couldn't take care of yourself anymore, even though that's obviously not true." Robert stepped forward then, giving me a warm hug. "You look good, Eleanor. Portland agrees with you. Freedom agrees with me," I corrected him with a smile. We went over the plan for the press conference. I would speak first, giving my account of what had happened and why I had left Boston. Then Robert would speak as someone who had known me for years and could attest to my competence. Lily and Marcus would talk about my integration into the Portland community. Officer Rivera would confirm that I had voluntarily presented myself to the police as a competent adult who had relocated by choice. And finally, Amy would speak briefly about her relationship with me and her confidence in my ability to make my own decisions. As 10 a.m. approached, my nervousness gave way to a steady resolve. This was my chance to reclaim my narrative, to assert publicly what I knew to be true, that I was not confused or incompetent, but a woman who had made a difficult but necessary choice to preserve her autonomy. I stepped up to the podium, aware of the cameras and microphones pointed in my direction. The fog had lifted, and weak winter sunshine filtered through the bare branches of the garden's fruit trees. I took a deep breath and began. "Good morning. My name is Eleanor Miller. As some of you may know, my daughter Sarah Winters held a press conference earlier today, describing me as confused and cognitively impaired. She asked for help finding me so she could return me to Boston and place me in a memory care facility. I'm here today to tell you that I don't need to be found. I'm not lost, I'm not confused, and I'm not experiencing cognitive decline." I went on to explain exactly what had happened, how I had overheard Sarah and Kevin planning to commit me to Pinwood Gardens after Christmas, how I had made the difficult decision to leave in the night, and how I had deliberately chosen Portland as a place to start anew. I left Boston not because of confusion, but because of clarity. I saw clearly that my daughter and son-in-law were planning to strip me of my autonomy and assets under the guise of concern for my welfare. I chose to leave rather than be forced into a situation where I would lose control of my own life. I spoke about my new apartment, my involvement with the community garden, the friends I was making. I emphasized that I was financially independent, physically capable of caring for myself, and mentally sharp. "I'm 78 years old," I concluded. "I have wrinkles and gray hair. I move a little slower than I used to. But age is not the same as incapacity. Being elderly does not mean I am unable to make decisions about my own life. I chose Portland. I chose freedom, and I am asking now to be allowed to live the life I have chosen." Robert spoke next, his attorney's training evident in his clear, persuasive presentation. He described his long relationship with me, emphasized his observations of my mental acuity, and explained the legal concept of elder autonomy. Eleanor Miller is not a ward of the state or of her daughter, he stated firmly. She is a competent adult with the right to live where she chooses and make her own decisions. Any attempt to force her into care against her will would be a violation of her rights and dignity. Lillian Marcus followed, speaking warmly about my involvement in the garden and my quick integration into the community. Officer Rivera confirmed that I had voluntarily presented myself to the police and appeared fully competent and aware. And then it was Amy's turn. My granddaughter stepped up to the podium, looking nervous but determined. At 16, she was facing a room full of reporters to defend her grandmother against her own mother, a position no child should ever have to be in. My heart ached for her, even as it swelled with pride. My grandmother is the smartest person I know, Amy began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She taught me how to read, how to garden, how to stand up for myself. She is not confused or impaired. She's the same grandma who helped me with my algebra homework last summer and remembered every single detail about my friends and my activities. Amy's voice broke slightly as she continued. I love my mom, but she's wrong about this. Grandma doesn't need to be in a home. She doesn't need to be rescued. She needs to be respected and allowed to live her life the way she wants to. And I support her completely. As Amy stepped back, I saw movement at the edge of the gathered crowd. Sarah stood there, her face pale, Kevin at her side. She must have seen the press conference announced on the morning news and come directly from her hotel. Our eyes met across the garden, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression. Shock, maybe, or recognition. Then her face hardened, and she turned to whisper urgently to Kevin. The reporters noticed her presence and began calling questions. Mrs. Winters, what's your response to your mother's statement? Mrs. Winters, did you know your mother was in Portland voluntarily? Mrs. Winters, what about your daughter's support of your mother? Sarah stepped forward, her composure visibly strained. My mother is clearly being manipulated by these strangers, she said, gesturing toward Lily and Marcus. And my ex-husband has always tried to turn my daughter against me. This doesn't change the fact that my mother needs professional care. That's not true, Mom, Amy said, stepping forward to stand beside me. Grandma is fine, you're the one who's not listening. The confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating was happening in front of cameras and reporters. It was messy and painful and public, everything I would have avoided in my previous life. But I stood my ground, Amy's hand firm in mine, Robert and my new friends flanking us like guards. Sarah, I said, my voice gentle but firm, I'm not coming back to Boston. I'm not going to Pinwood Gardens. I'm staying here in Portland, in my new home, with my new friends, and my garden plot and my independence. You can accept that and find a way to have a relationship with me on these new terms, or you can continue fighting me, but you won't win. Sarah's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. This isn't over, she said, her voice low but carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over the garden. You're not well, Mom. You need help. She turned and walked away, Kevin hurrying after her. The reporters surged forward with more questions, but Robert stepped up to the podium. Mrs. Miller has said all she needs to say today, he announced. She is not missing, not confused, and not in need of rescue. She is living independently by choice and asks for respect for her privacy and autonomy going forward. Thank you. As the press conference broke up, I felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation with Sarah had been painful but necessary. I had stated my truth publicly with witnesses and supporters. I had reclaimed my narrative. Amy hugged me tightly. I'm so proud of you, Grandma, she whispered. You were amazing. It wasn't, she admitted, but it was the right thing to do. We left the garden together, Amy, Robert, Lily, and I, heading to a nearby restaurant for lunch. As we walked, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had set down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for years. The confrontation wasn't the end, I knew. Sarah wouldn't give up easily. There might be legal battles ahead, more public scrutiny, difficult conversations. But I had taken the first and hardest step. I had declared my independence, not just by leaving Boston in the night, but by standing publicly in my truth. Whatever came next, I would face it with the same courage and clarity that had brought me to this moment. As we settled into a booth at the restaurant, Lily raised her water glass in a toast. "To Eleanor," she said, "who reminds us all that it's never too late to choose yourself." "To choosing yourself," Amy echoed, her young face solemn and proud. I sipped my water, looking around at these people who had become my allies and advocates in such a short time. This wasn't the life I had planned or expected. It was better, richer, more authentic, more mine. "To new beginnings," I said, raising my own glass. "And to the courage to walk away from what no longer serves us." Outside, the Portland winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the city that had become my refuge and my home. In leaving everything behind, I had found something precious myself. And that, I knew with absolute certainty, was worth fighting for. The media coverage of our dueling press conferences was intense, but mercifully brief. For a few days, I was the runaway grandmother, or elderly woman who fled families' care plans in headlines across the country. But as is the nature of news cycles, a political scandal soon pushed my story off the front pages, allowing me to begin building my new life with less scrutiny. Sarah didn't give up easily. She filed for emergency guardianship in Massachusetts, claiming I was incapable of managing my own affairs. But thanks to Robert's legal expertise and the evidence we had gathered, including statements from Officer Rivera and my new friends in Portland, medical evaluations from doctors in Oregon who confirmed my competence, and my own clear and coherent testimony, the petition was denied. The judge ruled that I was a competent adult making an unorthodox but rational choice. Amy stayed in Portland for a week before reluctantly returning to Boston to finish her school year. But we made plans for her to spend spring break and much of the summer with me. Sarah was furious about this arrangement, but Robert stood firm, reminding her that their custody agreement gave him equal say in Amy's activities. "I'll come back as soon as I can," Amy promised as we hugged goodbye at the airport. "We'll plant your garden together." "I'll be counting the days," I told her, marveling at how this difficult situation had strengthened our bond rather than weakening it. Slowly, my new life took shape. My garden plot was assigned, and I began planning what I would grow. I joined a book club that met at the local library, and a gentle yoga class specifically for seniors. I made friends, not just Lily and Marcus, but others, Mrs. Chen, who invited me for tea and turned out to be an avid mystery reader, like myself. Arthur, a widower from my book club who walked me home each week, our conversations growing longer with each stroll. Another gardener who specialized in medicinal herbs and taught me about plants I'd never grown before. 3 months after my midnight escape, I received a letter from Sarah. Not an email or a text, but an actual letter, her handwriting familiar and painful on the envelope. I let it sit on my kitchen table for 2 days before finding the courage to open it. "Mom," she had written, "I still believe you made a reckless and dangerous choice. I still worry about you living so far away without family nearby, but I've come to accept that I can't control your decisions, and fighting you publicly has only damaged our relationship further." She went on to apologize, not for wanting me in a care facility, but for the way things happened, and for not communicating better. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I might have wished for, but it was a start, a recognition that I was not simply a problem to be managed, but a person with agency and rights. "I miss you," she concluded. "Amy misses you. If you're willing, I'd like to come visit this summer. Just me, not Kevin, to see your new life and try to understand your choice better." I wrote back the same day, accepting her tentative olive branch. Our relationship was damaged, perhaps irreparably changed, but not completely destroyed. Time and distance might even allow something new and healthier to grow in its place. Spring arrived in Portland with an explosion of cherry blossoms and daffodils. My garden plot flourished with early greens and peas climbing up trellises Marcus helped me build. I kept busy, filling my days with purposeful activity and my evenings with good books and occasional dinners with friends. 1 year to the day after my escape, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment. Amy visiting for the weekend, Lily, Marcus, Robert in town on business, Mrs. Chen, and Arthur, whose walks home with me had evolved into regular dinner dates and a tender, unexpected romance. We raised glasses of sparkling cider to mark the anniversary of what Amy had dubbed my Independence Day. I never thought I'd be celebrating running away at my age, I told them, looking around at these dear faces that had become my chosen family. But here I am, 79 years old and finally understanding what freedom really means. To freedom, Arthur said, his eyes crinkling as he smiled at me, and to the courage it takes to claim it. Later, after everyone had gone home and Amy was asleep in my small guest room, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, frightened, defensive, backed into a corner by those who claimed to love me, and I thought about the woman I was now, still aging, still facing the challenges that come with growing older, but doing so on my own terms, surrounded by people who respected my choices. I hadn't been abandoned that Christmas Eve when I slipped away from Sarah's house in the dark. I had been released from others' expectations, from the narrow role of the compliant elderly mother, from a future mapped out for me, without my consent. In leaving, I had found not just a new home, but a new self, or perhaps I had simply reclaimed the self I had always been beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation. Either way, as I turned from the window and prepared for bed, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. This apartment, this city, this life, they were mine by choice. And in a world that too often pushes older women to the margins, renders them invisible, or infantilizes them as helpless, that choice was the most precious freedom of all. Some might call what I did running away, but I knew better. I hadn't run away from anything. I had run toward something essential, the right to be the author of my own story, right up to the final page.